The narrative of this panel is really to kind of have the broad discussion around everything from the Kiwisaver 10-year anniversary retrospective and perspective, talking about retirement, savings, financial capability, what does good in retirement look like, and so forth. I'm not going to overly set the context because I think Minister Joyce did, and my earlier comments certainly did. What I'm going to do is invite Nick Sherry to address us and perhaps just set the scene in a global sense, both given his previous roles but his current role, in terms of what he sees as the world of super, Kiwisaver, retirement savings and retirement. Nick, welcome.
Thanks, Richard. Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. In my post-political career, I was Australia's first Minister for Superannuation and Corporate Law. I've now been in the superannuation space in Australia for some 31 years in a range of different roles. I don't intend to say a lot about Australia today. I could talk to you in excruciating detail about it. Happy to engage with you. I'm here until tomorrow, one-on-one, if you want more detail, and hopefully I'm sure in the discussion we'll touch on aspects of Australia. But since I retired 5 years ago, I should acknowledge I'm the APAC chair of FNZ, and I think the Minister referred to great export businesses, an amazing example of a very successful New Zealand company that's now a global technology business and doing very, very well, and acknowledge Charlie Trotter, our MD in New Zealand, who I work closely with as chair of that company. But I also do a lot of work globally on pensions. I find it quite a fascinating and very interesting subject. So I'm just going to give you a few global insights in about 5 or 6 minutes about what is happening in the world of retirement incomes, whether we call it pensions or superannuation retirement incomes. What is happening and why? And I think if I got, yes, success. The three pillars, as it is known globally, Pillar 1, a basic pension, I'm sure you're familiar with. Pillar 2 is an additional income related, usually, certainly in the past, been defined benefit, but increasingly shifting to what we call defined contribution. And then Pillar 3, voluntary contributions to a retirement income system. I mean, centrally to the world of change in pensions is what's happened with Pillar 1. Pillar 1 100 years ago was only a very low and basic protection. When pensions were introduced in countries, it was a very modest benefit and seen as a safety net. And the reality was 100 years ago, when pensions were introduced in developing economies, most people didn't even live long enough to receive it. Of course, that's changed dramatically in the last 100 years. The other big change in pensions up until the last 20 years has been the growth in benefit level. And so we've seen at Pillar 2, depending on the country, an increase in benefits and an extension of benefits from well beyond what was a basic safety net originally to, in most countries, an income-related benefit, which increased the expense and costs of pension systems in most countries. So in Australia's case, of course, our Pillar 1 is known as our age pension. It's a government payment, pay as you go. In the New Zealand case, it's superannuation. Pillar 2, and to the extent you have Pillar 3 in New Zealand, it's Kiwisaver. In Australia, Pillar 2 and Pillar 3 is superannuation. Of course, no one else in the world uses the term superannuation. It's unique to Australia and New Zealand, even if we apply it in different ways. The pressures for reform, it's overwhelmingly demographic, and I don't think I'd be telling you, frankly, anything new, but there are two demographic pressures which have enormous implications, not just on retirement income systems, but on society more general. We are living longer, in developed economies, an increase in life expectancy between 1 and 2 years every 10 years since 1850. And it's a remarkably straight, consistent line. Since 1850, improved health, elimination of disease, etc. So longevity, and of course, as I mentioned, most people didn't even live to collect a pension when they were dying in their early mid-60s when age pensions were introduced. Today, in advanced economies, Australia is a typical example. If you make the age of 65 in Australia, on average, you will live, as a female, you'll live to the age of 89, a male will live to the age of 85. So 20 to 25 years paying people a retirement income, 20 to 25 years. And obviously 100 years ago, it was never envisaged that that would be the length of time that people would receive a retirement income. And that's often talked about. There's a global debate, including here, about increasing retirement ages. But the second issue that doesn't get perhaps quite the attention it should, but it's what I call the double whammy. It's putting enormous pressure on pension systems globally, is the birth rate. The birth rate for replacement rate, 2.1 children per family, has been dropping. What I've done there is just list a number of countries and then in brackets the year they dropped below replacement rate. And again, most advanced economies in the world, and interestingly, many developing economies, their birth rate is now below replacement rate. Interestingly, what I call the Anglo-Celtic countries, UK, New Zealand, US, Australia, haven't dropped as far. They're still below replacement rate. They haven't dropped as far because they're high migration countries, and migrants, certainly first generation, tend to have a higher birth rate, and that has kept the birth rate a little higher in Anglo-Celtic countries than, say, typically Europe or Eastern Asia, Japan, etc. I just mention a couple of interesting countries. Japan is catastrophe. They're down to 1.6. Their population is dropping at the rate of 225,000 people a year. It's an extraordinary phenomenon. The population's literally dropping now. They have no migration. It's not acceptable to allow any migrants into Japan. But the underlying cause of all this, which is again, I don't think well understood, is why is the birth rate dropping? And it's because of women's education since the 60s and 70s. Women are now making decisions to have children later in life and a smaller number of children. I'm not critical of it, but it's all around women's education, involvement in the workforce. The majority of students coming through universities in most advanced economies are women. This is an extraordinarily radical social change in our, at the moment, largely Western societies. It's extraordinarily radical. And so this double whammy is putting enormous pressure on pension systems because our dependency ratio with a low replacement rate, and it's a really interesting phenomenon. You might wonder why I put Iran up there. You would assume that a conservative Islamic country, the birth rate would be very high. But in fact, in Iran, and whilst very different culturally in countries, conservative Catholic countries like Spain and Italy, the birth rate has also dropped dramatically below replacement rate. And the phenomenon is educated women, and interestingly in Iran, women are well educated, having access to health and making decisions about having children, and the same in Italy and Spain, which are generally conservative Catholic countries. This is an extraordinary phenomenon. So the double whammy, enormous pressure on pension systems as we understand them. So they're the main pressures, but I've listed a number of other issues I've encountered. I've worked globally over the last 5 years in 19 countries, including Greece. I mean, that was the most challenging project I've ever done in my life on pensions. But there's a whole set of other factors that are influencing and impacting on pensions. Budget deficits. Obviously, if you've got a cost to your budget going up that you can't control, to some extent I agree with the Minister's comments about health being a rapid, but there are controls you can make on health costs. The trouble with pensions is there's an automatic escalator in cost because of longevity and the dependency ratio. It's much harder to control and politically very challenging to shift. But budget deficits, you can only increase budget deficits or allow budget deficits. And of course, the global financial crisis made all of that a lot worse. The global financial crisis also exposed pension deficits, particularly in Europe, made it much more transparent and obvious. And also the financial crisis, obviously, confidence in the broader financial sector was really hit. And a lot more suspicion and criticism, particularly of large financial institutions, fees, conflicts of interest, etc. Financial scandals, every country's had them, mis-selling, conflicts of interest. Now, the point I make about those sort of issues is in the world of pensions, they are much more sensitive because if you have a compulsory system, whether it's Australia compulsory or New Zealand, you're in, but you can opt out, these issues are much more sensitive politically. I don't know what's happened to the slides. Increase in retirement ages. I've just gone quickly to reforms. The most obvious way to contain the cost of a retirement income system is to increase retirement ages. And I've listed a range there, and obviously there's an increase on the way in New Zealand, although I haven't included it in the chart. Really interestingly, look at the bottom 5. This is not an exclusive list. Japan, Korea and China, with their demographics, ageing population and dependency ratio, have not increased their pension age. Catastrophe if they don't do something hard and fast. I've put Poland because Poland was increasing its pension age, female 60, male 65 to 67 in 2017. The end of last year they actually reversed it. A conservative nationalist government appealing to older voters, and it reversed the increase in the age pension. And the last one where I was directly involved is Greece. Female pension age of 55-60, a male 60. They increased the pension age overnight in one hit to 67 in 2015. They had no option. And then the other interesting aspect of this is Australia, UK, US haven't increased, or if they have increased it, the access age at Pillar 2 and 3 is a lot lower than their age pension at Pillar 1. So in Australia, the access age is 55 to 60, but the age pension age is 65 and a half. A couple of other options on pension reforms. A lower pension, you can change the indexation provision. The government in Australia has announced it wants to change, for example, the indexation of the Australian pension from male earnings to inflation. In the UK, there's a big debate about what's called the triple lock, which underpins the highest of inflation, wages, etc., on increasing the UK pension. In Greece, things were so desperate that they introduced a special new tax on pensioners. They only excluded the new tax from lower pension income earners. A new tax of 25 to 50% on your age pension in Greece as a result of their crisis. The other responses, closed DBs, particularly at Pillar 2, this phenomenon of increasing benefits, particularly defined benefits at Pillar 2, is now unsustainable. And so we've seen the retreat of defined benefits in the private sector. But interestingly, in the Anglo-Celtic world, Australia is the only country that has closed its public sector DBs as well. And then we have, as I've mentioned, at Pillar 2 and 3, a clear shift to defined contribution. There's many examples of that: Switzerland, Chile, Australia, Sweden, Hong Kong, New Zealand with Kiwisaver is another example. So there's a definite shift at Pillar 2. I've said China. China does have a DC system that is introduced, but many of the accounts are empty because the government organisations have been using the money in the DC accounts to pay the DB liabilities. Really challenging stuff. And then there's a couple of countries where it's DC only, and that's Singapore, Hong Kong and Chile. Interestingly, in Chile, when they shut down the government pension system and introduced DC, the military made sure they kept their DB pension, but then they were the government of Chile at the time. The real Australian favourite, it's not a favourite anywhere else in the world, is means testing the pension. You know Australia's pension is means tested. A quarter of Australia's population over age 65 get no age pension. Another 20% get part age pension. When I mentioned this to the Greeks, you should have seen the look on their faces of horror that you would means test and remove them from the pension. And then, of course, again in Australia recently and the UK and other countries, we're seeing new caps on limits for contributions into DC systems, lower caps, yearly caps, some quite dramatic new provisions to contain the cost of DC systems. Finished there.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick, and really interesting kind of global perspective around the three pillars and the challenges. I guess the task now is to kind of dive into a little of detail in terms of what's going on here. My first question to Diane, and Diane, thanks for joining us. You've done, I thought, an amazing job late last year with the release of the report and the way you engage the New Zealand community. What's your read on how New Zealand can take some of these global themes and get the system right here?
Yeah. Now, can everybody hear me okay? Great. So the review of retirement income policies, which is something we do every 3 years, which we completed in 2016 and submitted in December 2016. The starting point for the review inevitably was the data. We raided everything we could find that was existing and then filled the gaps with stuff we couldn't find. So MSD and IMBI and Treasury and Massey, thank you, and everybody else who'd done some great work. And we all know this stuff, don't we? To be really honest, we kind of know this. Dependency ratios are changing. We're living longer, healthier, and then, unfortunately, we're living longer, unhealthier too. So we talked a bit about the increased cost of super, $30 million a day, going to $98 million a day. But as the Minister said earlier, healthcare is something we mustn't forget and increases. So look, we went through all of this, but you know, we kind of know this, and I didn't want the review to be about what we already knew. And I had concerns that the aggregated data actually didn't tell us really what we needed to know to make the recommendations around policy. We know we're having fewer babies, thank you for that. I just want to make just a slight point that those pesky educated women, I just want to make the point, I don't think they make the decision on their own. So I think as we go through it, broadly, whoever you're having the baby with is part of the agreement. So I think probably we should recognise and reflect that. But anyway, moving on. So with the review, we said, look, here's all the stuff we know, and we kind of all know it. What don't we know? And that's what we took to New Zealand. And the point about that was you know, we literally took it on the road. We went through shopping malls and up and down New Zealand. We got verbally abused and shouted at, and then we had some wonderful conversations. We interviewed around 350 people on camera. We got around 12,000 people submitting stuff online. In addition, another 12,000 comments. We surveyed 500 workplaces about the ageing workforce. So it was pretty extensive. We took 7 themes across 7 months: who gets what, who pays for what, Kiwisaver, etc. So all of that work informed our recommendations around what is inevitably an ecosystem a retirement income ecosystem. Often it comes down to age of eligibility. It's not, actually. You can't talk about that without talking about the workplace, without talking about Kiwisaver, and without talking about health and all the interdependencies. So I tell you some of the things we found that were a bit surprising. When you look at people in their 50s and 60s in New Zealand, actually unemployment is low and workforce participation is high. If I was sitting in Wellington on my rear end looking at spreadsheets, I would think job done, we don't have an issue. When you open it up and you hear from New Zealanders, actually what we heard from were people in their 50s who, while they were managing to work, were actually extraordinarily frightened about their job prospects, about losing a job, about where they were at with their savings. And I'm 50. There's something about being in your 50s where you feel time is running out and maybe you haven't done enough with the first 50 years and you're quite frightened about how that's going to take you into maybe the next 30. So there was an extraordinary amount of pain coming from people in their 50s that we hadn't seen in the numbers, and that was really very important. So I recommended the age of eligibility should go up. I believe it needs to. I think it should anyway, but I also believe that we should invest heavily in identifying what people need in their 50s to enable them to continue to be healthy, to work, to prepare the workplace for them, and prepare them for the workplace. And what people said to me resoundingly is, we want to work, actually. We enjoy working. We want to be part of society. We want to have meaning in our lives. We want to get up in the morning and have something to do. So I'll just spin through a few other things. I'm conscious of time. The 500 organisations we asked about what work they had underway for the ageing workforce, I'm afraid 83% of them said nothing. We have nothing underway. We roasted them, and we think some of them have got something underway now, and my colleague David Boyle has got a cunning plan that he's developing in that space. Kiwisaver, we went out with a hypothesis that people weren't contributing because they couldn't afford to. And people had said that online at times, and that was where we'd started. I sat in Kaikoui, I sat all around New Zealand face to face, and people said, actually, we're just going to come clean. It's not an affordability issue. We just don't believe we'll get it back. So I could put money in, but I'm worried I won't see it again, and I'm also worried I won't live to 65. So the game changers there were, actually, it is your money in your name. You will see it again, A. And B, if you don't think you'll live to 65, you can leave it in a will to a family member. The mood of the room changed instantly, so those are key messages. I just want to wrap up with the stuff that came through about the next generation. You know, they do have, I don't have grandchildren yet, but when I do, and I hope I do, our grandchildren will have a different view of work and a different relationship with work. The young people we're speaking to didn't view it that you slogged your guts out for the man for 40 years and, you know, deferred gratification until the sweet release of retirement. You know, that's not how young people are viewing their life. It's not how they're viewing work. They don't see retirement as sudden. They see it that they have education, they work, they might take time out, more education, more work, maybe different type of work. They see it as a movable feast. So attitudes to work are changing, and actually the nature of work is changing, and all that intergenerational fighting that we've got going on is deeply unhelpful and not very constructive, and frankly the arguments kind of got lost. It's got lost along the way. I'm not even sure what we're even saying anymore. It's become dominated by housing, and it mustn't. And one of the things that I was reminded of when I was talking to people in different places is those naughty baby boomers with their mortgage-free houses, many of them worked very hard to get there. And they've been the benefit of rising house prices, I get that. But you know what? I heard stories of people sitting on packing cases for 6 months because they couldn't afford a couch. People going out for dinner once a year as a special treat. Things weren't handed to people. And we seem to have lost that in this debate. The other thing I'll say is that I'm quite jealous, really, of the time that young people will have. They will literally have more years than my generation. Diseases that killed my generation, the younger generations will live with and will overcome because of medical advancements made. So can we not just reduce it to housing, please? Can we make it about the many things that life is made up of? And can we also remember, and that's actually the case for some people in this room, what people did to get in the position they're in? Because there are some phenomenal stories in all of that. I will shut up now and hand back to you, Richard, but I'm happy to delve into any of that stuff.
So that's a pretty fascinating run through of, that kind of generational piece and the future of work and the nature of work. And with a 16-year-old, I'm starting to see that stuff play through because his future will be very different to ours. Leo, I'm going to go to you, almost with a sense of, we're 10 years on. What can we celebrate about kind of Kiwisaver with the 42 billion and the 16,000 average balances and so on?
Firstly, the women are in the workplace because they're contributing, so that's fantastic. Because without them, we couldn't open our doors of business every day. So I think the challenge we've got is I'm not so worried about compulsion. I'm worried about just straight participation. So we're making some progress, but let's be honest in this room, a lot of that has displaced other savings. The data says that. So we've still got a problem of consumption over savings, and it's not actually broadly an affordability issue. There are many who face affordability issues, so I think we need to be real about that. I'm not sure the 42% of people not contributing anything last year are all building radio stations or other entrepreneurial businesses. That's not the data I get. So I accept the Minister's view that may be the case in some situations, but we just have a lot of people who have chosen to not participate. And to the point Diane raises, I think that's really sad because they're essentially saying, I don't have an aspiration for the future or an aspiration for a better future for me and my loved ones. So I think the real challenge we've all got is, we don't want to do the David Longy cup of tea thing and go 42, all trucking along, because I think we're not really at the point where we've made the kind of progress we would hope. And I don't want to be here self-congratulatory saying there's 42 billion and we're making good progress. I think we've made some progress. I think we've got an enormous amount to do with the community to address core things like Diane mentioned. People still think that they won't get the money or that someone's going to put their hands on it. That's real basic understanding, and we've collectively got to figure out how to solve for that.
Cool. We might come back to some of that kind of insight around success, because I think 10 years ago there wasn't, and I hail from Australia, and when I started work there wasn't, unless you were in kind of managerial roles, and yet today across the ditch there's $2.3 trillion that drives the engine of so many parts of the economy, and here with 42 billion base, there's a lot to celebrate, and it's kind of getting that balance, but for sure. Claire, just pointing to you, Massey and Workplace Savings have done a lot of research over a lot of years about what does good look like in retirement, both from a financial and lifestyle point of view. What's your take on this broader debate?
Well, what good looks like in retirement really depends on what an individual wants. Fundamentally, and this is kind of reflected in the way we've chosen to talk about our expenditure guidelines, good in retirement is about having choices. So what we don't want is that people get into retirement and they're stuck because they've got a certain amount of money and that dictates what they can and can't do. What we want people to be able to do in retirement is to have choices. So do they want to work? We don't want them working because they have to, we want them working because they want to. And the reality is, despite what we keep getting told, a lot of older people do want to keep working. They want to change the type of work they're doing. They don't necessarily want to be working full time, and they don't want to be doing 7 a.m. till 10 p.m. type days, but they'd like to continue working. I usually quote my late father-in-law, who didn't actually fully retire until the age of 81. He was doing a totally different job in the last 10, 15 years, and he wasn't working full time, but he was working because he enjoyed it. He enjoyed getting out and meeting people, and that's what we want. So it is about having choices. It's about being able to travel if you want to. It's about being able to spend time with your family if you want to. Whatever you want to do in retirement, a good retirement is about being able to do that. And it's about being able to do that at the age that you want to. So not being focused on the age of eligibility for New Zealand superannuation, but determining at what age do I want to start changing the way I work and the way I live my life. For some people, that might be at 50, it might be at 55. For others, they're not going to make any substantial change to the age of 70. And again, it's about having the choices to be able to do that. It's really unfortunate. Again, I keep telling my family they're unfortunate because I keep using them as examples, but different people have different ability to do things. But I've got a couple of people in my broader family currently who are going to turn 65 next year. And they're basically counting down the days to when they get New Zealand superannuation. And I find that really, really sad. There's no reason for either of them why they can't continue to work, why they can't continue to do things. Why should they be so focused on a particular birthday? It just, to me, doesn't seem right. And that's what we've got to think about with retirement, with superannuation, is about giving people choices so that they don't have to be focused on a birthday, don't have to be focused on New Zealand superannuation, and can do the things that they really want to do.
So there's a great follow-up question, and I might go to Anna with this one, which is, so whose responsibility is it to kind of lead this debate that the world is changing and 65 is just arbitrary and there's policy stuff and demographic stuff? Well, what's your take on that, Anna?
Well, I guess in the middle of a campaign, it's a good time to start that debate. I think, look, I've got to commend the governments, I guess, on dealing with the problems of today, and that's probably where they will win the votes. But I think, look, there is a tsunami coming. We've talked about the ageing population. We've talked about the needs for better retirement savings for New Zealanders. I think, look, and reflecting on the Minister's comments this morning, I also don't believe that every New Zealander is an entrepreneur. I think we all think we want to be, but we aren't all entrepreneurs, and we're not all going to be able to sell our radio stations or our businesses, you know, to fund that future that we want and that comfortable lifestyle that we want. I think the other thing, you know, that the Minister touched on is, look, everyone does need a house to live in their retirement, and it's really important that people pay their mortgages off. What I struggle with is, let's not wait till we're 50 to start saving for our retirement. We need to, I guess, help New Zealanders start thinking about, you know, saving a little bit for longer, as opposed to, you know, wait till the point, you know, and Diane is there. You know, if you started now, it's a lot harder than me, who's a little bit younger, and can start today or tomorrow.
Oh, you're younger than me.
Look, so who is it? It's not just the government, though. It's not just the government that needs to make... yes, I'm younger and I'm a woman. It's not just the government that needs to, I guess, drive the policy, and I guess that's why we've seen, you know, Diane's review come out. We've seen 2 good reports out this week that start sparking that debate around the questions that we need to solve, the long-term problems, not the problems for today that are going to win the votes. I guess I get really concerned about what is this going to mean for future governments? What is this going to mean for New Zealanders of the future? Look, signalling increased age of eligibility for super is a great start, and that's where we have to head. But it probably makes Kiwisaver that much more important, particularly as people work, you know, may not be working to that magic year of 65. They may well finish earlier, they may well finish later. Contributions, I think, is the biggest thing for me, and you know, overwhelming support for increasing flexibility and even compulsory level of contributions for New Zealanders. And that has to help, I think, us get ahead in the game for the future.
If I just go to Diane, because I think your day job is kind of influencing policy, right? Putting good policy on the table, and you obviously have a lot to do politically. How much drive is there within the political process to kind of see the future versus now debate as kind of trading off some decisions for short-term versus the long-term?
I mean, to be fair, the bread and butter of the Commission really is building financial capability. You know, that is, and I'll say that after I say this, because that's really important. On the policy front, I had a theory at the beginning of the review that actually I didn't need to change the government's mind, I needed to change the public's mind. Because ultimately, policy follows popular culture in many respects, because we're in a democracy. I met with a Chinese delegation a while ago who laughed their heads off and said, why don't you just tell people, well, we're in a democracy. So the point about policy is if it remains wholly unpalatable to the voter and the taxpayer, it's very hard to get it across the line, and you've got to be realistic about that. People do tend to vote on what's happening today, what they see today, what they understand today, and what's coming into the pay packet today, and how they can manage their finances. Our job, and the job of this room to an extent, is to see what other people can't see and to translate it and articulate it in a way that is interesting and compelling for people. And that, don't underestimate how hard that is. We talk way too much jargon. There's one thing we did with the review. I don't know if you guys have seen our naughty Ken and Barbie videos, but and a taxi driver in Hastings was telling me how much he enjoyed them the other day. But if there's one thing we did, we took the jargon out of it. Otherwise, we have no hope of getting people to understand and plan for the future. Dependency ratios is a dumb term. A lot of this is just clunky language. Intergenerational equity simply means, what do I owe my children and what do they owe me? That's what it means. So we could just say that. Really quickly, got to say, financial capability, we just got 10.4 million additional from the government across 4 years for schools. We work with people across a lifetime to build capability across a lifetime, because reaching retirement in good shape is little and long. It is slow. And so we're starting in schools. Anyone here who's a parent, please, please, please say to your school and the teachers and the principals, we want it in the schools, because the problem we have at the moment is that teachers don't want to teach it. So anyone who's got any influence, who's on a school board of trustees, please, use that influence, because it matters.
So this feels like progress. We can't just say it's up to the politicians to make the call, but equally it's got to come from within the community, and there's probably a combination. Nick, obviously you've been down this path before across in Australia, and you see it globally. What does best practice look like? How do you overcome this today versus tomorrow piece?
Just on the Australian context, look, I do accept generally politicians follow. I mean, I was a politician for 22 years. Generally, politicians do follow on the majority of issues, because it's a democracy. You have to respond to the will of the people, however that's expressed, or the particular philosophical and practical program that any political party will put forward. But occasionally, and the interesting thing about Australian superannuation, it wasn't a product of widespread community debate. It was top down. It was Paul Keating and a small group of people who said, we are going to have compulsory superannuation, come what may. There was no community debate. Occasionally, governments of either political persuasion, left or right of centre, do make calls, and they can get away with it occasionally. And in Australia's case, Keating got away with mandatory superannuation. But despite what you might hear in Australia now, where everyone lauds our system, $2.3 billion, it's compulsory, a lot of those people opposed it. A lot of them opposed it. This was a very, very polarised debate in Australia when the debate occurred over a period of a couple of months when the legislation was presented. So occasionally governments do lead, and GST VAT is another interesting example. So the only other quick issue I'd mention is this, the concept of working longer, which I'm an advocate of and I think is inevitable. But no government, no country I can find has done particularly well, has tried to overcome a lot of the fears for people who, we've seen the end of lifelong working, we've seen the decline in manufacturing, changing labour market. And there's a lot of fear amongst people 50 plus, particularly blokes who've lost their job. And what we haven't done well in any country is have a much greater focus on lifelong learning, particularly for this age group. It's all very well having choices, but you don't have much choice if you haven't got the skills to maintain work and employment in the modern economy into your 70s. And that is not done well anywhere. And the second issue is anti-discrimination. There is enormous amount of age discrimination. And we do need, I think, really hard, tough legislation in this area. Otherwise, what we're seeing bubbling up in a lot of Western democracies, the US, the UK, is a deep-seated resentment, and a lot of it's from blokes. A lot of it's very unreasonable. A lot of it's fear of migrants, fear of losing my job, the migrants are to blame. All this sort of stuff is bubbling up, and I think it's very dangerous, but it's very, very hard politically to overcome.
Yeah, really interesting. Folks, this is very interactive, so if you... Oh, we've got our first question. There you go. I'm going to come to that question. I've just got to go back to Blair with the elephants in the room. But if you do have a question, flick it through and the panel's happy to take it. Elephants in the room. Sometimes this industry is kind of seen as self-serving. You know, you're calling for more contributions so you can feather your own nest, make more money, charge more fees and so on, amongst many elephants in the room. What do you see where you sit at AMP in terms of managing the kind of the tougher debates with a consumer lens on?
I think the elephant in the room for the people in this room is, to Diane's point, we talk in gibberish, frankly, and consumers just turn off. So they're not actually, I mean, the fees debate is interesting. People can't actually figure that out in terms of truly what the cost is. You know, all the jargon we use. Frankly, we've got to get down to pretty basic conversations with people. They need to happen face to face, because most of my conversations, I couldn't wrap a legal or disclosure statement around it. But I just ask people a simple question: if you're not in Kiwisaver, you know, are you intending to die before 65? Because that's a reasonable strategy. You know, no, well, it is. For the people who proud tell me they've got other strategies, well, either you're, you know, massive entrepreneur or you plan to die early, because that's okay. But if you're intending to have some kind of retirement, you know, I just pull out Claire's work and go through the detail. You know, and the elephant in the room is the massive disconnect between New Zealanders' stated chocolate box view of retirement and the practical reality of their financial affairs right now. And when you look at the choices column in Claire's work, it doesn't match the choices that people describe to me. There's a massive gap. And if we aren't able to bridge that, we're just going to have a whole lot of people who purchase products and services from us who will be really unhappy, because they currently think the sticker on the box of the stuff they're buying from us is going to get them to a certain place. But it's hugely disconnected from what they describe to me in non-technical terms of their expected retirement outcome. And that's a huge problem in New Zealand. And I think Kiwisaver is perpetuating it, because they think 3 + 3, it's all good, happy days. And frankly, it ain't going to get them there.
Cool. We're going to go to the floor because there's a bunch of stuff coming in. And Diane, this one's for you. At what age is the financial capability education in schools targeted?
The money's been allocated to 5 to 18. However, it'd be fair to say that we think 10 to 15 is a really critical point. It's when that shit starts getting real, so to speak. You start to get an FBOS card, you get a mobile phone, you may be going, you know, out to McDonald's with your mates on your own. So it will be 5 to 18, but with a focus on 10 to 15. Also, as you're coming out of school, 16, 17, 18, you're starting to get debt literally thrown at you, and you're making some big decisions then. A different type of work will kick in there, but that's still a really critical period. 16 to 24 is when things can go horribly wrong and determine the rest of your life, frankly. And we deal with people at 25 who've racked up some extraordinary debt, not student debt, I don't mind that, debt on all sorts of other stuff that they can't even remember what they bought, and suddenly they owe 20 grand on a credit card and a couple of other things, and actually home ownership just goes out the window for them because they're too busy trying to pay down crazy debt that somehow they accumulated between 16 and 24.
Cool. And a question, I'll have a volunteer if anyone wants to have the first crack at this. The views of reducing Kiwisaver access, why can't I retire at age 60 and tap into my Kiwisaver?
Oh, look, I'll start. I guess if you want to retire at age 60 and you've only started saving at age 50, you're probably not going to have a lot to retire on. 65 is an arbitrary age to access your Kiwisaver, and I think, you know, it gives you that choices on top of New Zealand Super. So I think you can retire at any age you want. Whether you can use Kiwisaver or not will be very much down to where the mandated age for Kiwisaver access is. What is more important, I think, is to have a plan when do you want to retire? What kind of lifestyle do you want to have in your retirement? Work out how much time you've got to save up for that, and then you'll have the funds, whether they're in Kiwisaver or something that's unlocked, or sell your radio business.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that the third pillar is your voluntary contributions. The other ones you can access earlier. For most people, they're 3 plus 3 or less than that, given so few are contributing. Needs to be for a bit later. So I think we've got to get some advice wrapped around it.
Yeah. So okay, that's the segue, right? I guess the question is, how important is advice all the way through your Kiwisaver journey, rather than just kind of when you end up with a whole bunch of money? Maybe Claire, I'll start with you.
Yeah. Financial advice is fundamental, and that's the problem. A lot of people, they start their Kiwisaver and they're not even sure whether they're in the right fund. Are they in the right provider? They're often in the default provider, and they don't bother changing. They're in a balanced fund because that's what they end up in, and they don't make changes, and they're not getting the advice. And the problem is that there aren't enough advisors out there, and there's no financial incentive for the advisors to cater to that part of the market, unfortunately. So I think that's something that the providers can do better. There needs to be that provision throughout, and some checkpoints along the way that says, let's have a look at how you're going. So I think that's something that the providers could be doing.
Let's see what they say.
Yeah,
Anna.
look, agree completely. Look, advice is really important on the day that you join Kiwisaver. You don't have many decisions to make. What fund type am I going to be in? How much am I going to contribute, and is that going to get me to where I want to get to? Have I given my provider my email address so they can contact me? I think, look, when you join Kiwisaver, it's important to get that advice. I think at the age of 40, think about when you've just bought your first home. You do want to pay your mortgage, but you also don't want to miss the benefits of Kiwisaver. That's another good point. I think, look, 55 is critical. You're 10 years away from retirement. And 65, actually you're at that magical age. This isn't where we should be handing back money to our retirees. This is when they're going to need help most to make it last for the purpose they've been saving for.
I thought you had a great hair story on this one, Blair, didn't you?
You said I wasn't going to go provocative.
Go provocative.
I
Go
don't
ahead.
think I don't-
Well,
it's
I'll
not
take a
provocative.
take a broader view on advice. I'm of a view that insight's critical and expertise. If you ain't got it, you should get some, and you get that from an advisor. So I'm fine about people to DIY. Most of them, though, are not DIYs. They're just faking it till they make it. So that's an issue. Because there's the issue. People come to me and say they want to can do it themselves, but they just don't go through the effort. So advisors are there to coach and help them. My view on advice, though, is you need that way more regularly to actually save you from yourself, because people made bad consumption decisions. I mean, what's the point of being in Kiwisaver and beginning to save, but you have no insurance to manage the downside risk in your life? I mean, I talked to a friend on Tuesday who went to a funeral on Monday, 47-year-old female. She had Kiwisaver, had no life insurance, and dies of a brain aneurysm, and now there's the give a little thing up at the funeral. And I've been to a few funerals lately where they start to put give a little up. That's not the slide you want at your funeral. No. So frankly, advice has to be more broad, a broader conversation than just Kiwisaver, and that's what I worry about. Kiwisaver is dominating the conversation. New Zealanders are not getting themselves organised. So if you're not organised, get someone to help you. If you're unfit, people go for the gym, but we just don't have that methodology with advice. Equally, I'm sorry, it's not a charity business. So, I work with a lot of advisors, and they would, openly tell me the expectation from the consumers is that it's there for free. Well, it's not. So we have to find a better way of having that conversation, because people, to Diane's point, my normal reference point is people spend more having their hair done than they do on getting financial advice. So, which is more important? So, because fundamentally, we'll get more advice.
Your hair, Blair, clearly.
Well, for all the people who tell me they can't afford the advice, I ask them to show me the phone they're carrying, and it's generally an expensive iPhone. So, okay, so you can't afford the advice, but you've got a flash phone. It's pretty simple consumption stuff. To Claire's point, why they're not advised in the industry? Because actually it's pretty hard work to meet the thresholds, requirements, and actually run a profitable business. You talk to them, it is hard work.
So that's a great way to probably close. I'm going to ask everyone one last question, but certainly, you can't divorce this kind of broad set of advice from a Kiwisaver life, from an insurance and risk management piece. No. And I don't think any of us wander around in our worlds going, I'm here with my Kiwisaver hat on. It's, you just live life and you go, I need a financial solution. So I think in there is a whole bunch of opportunity. I'm going to close or ask you folks to close with the answer to this question. We're sitting here 10 years on. If we're sitting in the same room or a bigger room in 10 years' time, how will we know that we've been successful? And Diane, I might start with you.
I'm just going to pick a subject that's a very broad question. The thing that I care quite passionately about is there is discrimination against older workers, as point earlier. I don't think legislation is the answer there. You can always get around legislation. Actually, I think it's about our beliefs. I heard an HR director with a staff of 7,000 say 65-year-olds don't stand on a swivel chair to change a light bulb. We've got this view that older workers are less able and more expensive on ACC and other things. Actually, a lot of those are myths that need to be busted so that we understand the value of an older workforce. We're going to need them, and we need to manage the discrimination around hiring, training and retaining older workers. And if in 10 years we've made some massive progress with that, I will be extraordinarily happy.
Awesome. Anna?
Goodness, well, I might sell my radio station in 10 years if I start it. I think, look, things will be simple. New Zealanders will understand the benefits of Kiwisaver and, to Blair's point, probably more holistically, their health and their wealth, and be prepared for that no matter what eventuates between the age of, of the age of 18 and the age of, 105 or whatever we're going to live to.
Nick, how about for you?
I think, certainly in 10 years' time, the power of compound interest, the power of a compound return. We've seen that in Australia, but the outcomes are still modest, particularly for baby boomers. I think the one area, we've debated every issue uphill and down dale in Australia, but the one area that's not been well dealt with or well settled is the issue of what do you do with a lump sum at retirement? What are the post-retirement arrangements? And we're still debating this in Australia. And indeed, it's a big part of the debate globally in the UK. Lump sum, you literally massive lump sum. I've never seen this amount of money in their life. But Australia has not yet, in my view, developed an effective set of options for post-retirement. So my message is the sooner you do it, the better, and hopefully in New Zealand you do it a damn sight earlier than we have done in Australia.
Awesome. Claire?
I think we've been successful if in 10 years' time we don't feel we need to talk about Kiwisaver because it's just life. It's nothing we need to talk about, it's just what goes on.
Awesome. And Blair?
Well, and to that point, I hope that people in 10 years' time can match up their aspiration for retirement with the actual number and use, like Claire's doing, to actually calibrate that. Because if we've got people arriving at retirement happy and content, that will make for a great community.
That's awesome. That's been a really interesting debate and discussion, and hopefully pointers to what does good look like into the future. So on behalf of all of us here, thank you to an awesome panel.